Welcome, learners, to our mini lecture on cultural evolution, taking a more critical look at how we've evolved to this particular point in time, and especially in this specific region of the country. We're going to look at how we've evolved in the southwest region of the United States and how that evolutionary trajectory might predict where we will be in the future. So again, I will take a big concept from each chapter, one big concept, and I will go deeper by pulling a few key quotes from the assigned readings, starting with Chapter 10, An Occupied America. The big concept is that if Chicanos can become aware of why they are oppressed, they can work more effectively toward ending their colonization. Some key words from this quote, or from this concept rather: aware, oppressed, effectively, ending colonization. So if I want to end colonization, I'm going to need to be effective about it. And I'm going to need to do things that matter. When we talk about colonization, we're talking about oppression. And if we want to end colonization and oppression, we need a layer of awareness. So this whole book rather is meant to provide a critical layer of analysis that will bring some things into your awareness that used to not be there. And sometimes that awareness will be upsetting. And so I'm here to remind you that we're always going to learn with an attitude of curiosity and kindness. And this author actually does a really good job of talking about how they don't want to spark any hatred. So let's go deeper. So the colonization in the southwest region of the United States, which is the first sentence of this chapter, is this author says there used to be a traditional colonization in the 1800s where Anglo-Saxon white Americans imposed their way of living and their culture and their colonies on the inhabitants of Southwest America, the people who were already living here. So that is the Mexicans and the First Nations indigenous people, or Indians, as this author says. So this author is saying that we've moved away from that traditional slavery that was happening in the 1800s in Southwest America to a more internal colonization. It is occurring within the country rather than being imposed by an external power. So people from Spain are no longer taking a plane or a ship to come to America and creating an imbalanced power dynamic and forcing Americans to work for them. This author is saying that slavery mindset is actually happening by people who have been living in America, and they're creating that relationship with other Americans. And colonization is typically a group from a different part of the country or different part of the world coming and colonizing somewhere that is different from their homeland. And what do I mean when I say power dynamic that's not balanced? What do I mean when I say slavery mindset? The relationship between Anglos and Chicanos, let's define it, remains the same, that of master-servant. So why is the relationship of internal colonization between ethnic groups a problem? It's a problem because one of those groups is being defined and acting as master, and one group is being defined as the servant. And this, of course, creates an unequal set of opportunities, unequal power, unequal living in a country that claims, of course, that everyone can equally have rights and happiness and freedom. A more critical lens says, well, how can we be the American place of freedom when there's still some master servants happening in this country? The original colonias expanded in size, page 63, first paragraph, with the increased immigration and new settlements sprang up. This is in the Southwest region, the 1800s. I believe we're in the 1800s here. They became nations within a nation, in effect, for psychologically, which you can't see, socially and culturally, which you can sometimes see, they remained Mexican. But the colonias had little or no control over their political, economic, or educational destinies. In almost every case, they remained separate and unequal. So if one group of people, or if I want to go colonize a different village, here are some ways that I would control them. I would first control their educational system. Second paragraph, page 63. Anglos controlled the educational system. They administered the schools, taught in the classrooms, and designed the curriculum not to meet the needs of Chicano students, but to Americanize them. Second thing I would control would be the police. Their main purpose was to protect Anglo property. The third thing I would control would be the money. Let's see. Anglos owned the business and industry in the colonias, and capital that could have been used to improve the colonias was taken into Anglo-American sectors. So now we see this pattern. This pattern is one that emerged in most Chicano communities and one that contradicts the belief in Anglo-American equality. So we're challenging this idea of equality, equal power for all, by saying, let's analyze, is there equal power for all if the educational systems are being controlled, the police are being controlled, and the wealth is being controlled? How can that be equality? In some, even though many Chicanos are native-born U.S. citizens, this is still page 63, third paragraph, most Anglo-Americans still consider them Mexicans and outsiders. When we think of colonization, typically we think of a group of outsiders coming to conquer a group who already lives there. And this author is saying that mentality is still happening, even though both Mexican Americans and Anglo Americans are living in America. This might bring up some emotional resistance, some emotional discomfort. And I like that this author addresses that specifically. It is not my intention to rekindle hatreds, nor to condemn all Anglo-Americans collectively. Because that would not be a very effective way of change. Hatred and condemning and blaming and guilting and shaming, it doesn't move us forward. And we're here in the cultural evolution module because we want to move forward. So if we want to work effectively, we can't throw in hatred into the mix and condemnation. What we can do, if Chicanos can become aware of why they are oppressed and how the exploitation is perpetuated, remember that definition of culture is looking for patterns over time, how patterns get perpetuated, then they can work more effectively toward ending their colonization. So ending colonization requires reflection, awareness, but it doesn't stop there. We need awareness as well as action, because if we sit around and think too much, then we're not doing anything. We're not effectively ending colonization. But if we're acting without awareness, we might be doing things that aren't effective. We might be making the situation worse. We might be perpetuating what's been happening over time, but we want to break the cycle. We don't want to keep the cycle of exploitation and how it's perpetuated. I want to be a cycle breaker. How do I do that? The great humanistic task, the great historical task, because it is a task for humans, and it's been happening throughout history. This is not the first time we see it. It's not the first time we see a master-servant dynamic. It's happened before 1850s. So how do we end it? This great task of the oppressed, the people who are in the servant role, is to liberate themselves and not stop there, and liberate their oppressors as well. Wow. When the power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed contains reflection and action, both thinking and doing and thinking, then everybody benefits, because the people who are in the servant role gets liberated. The people who are in the master's role, they get liberated and freed from that power structure as well. Educational philosopher Paulo Freire is the person who came up with this idea of if you want to liberate yourselves, you're also going to have to liberate the people who have created this imbalanced power structure. And because there's no English word that means half action and half reflection, or half awareness rather, he came up with this new word called praxis. And it's this awareness that will, combined with action, will help us go against the forces that oppress not only the Chicanos, but the oppressor himself. So both people in this power dynamic, the master needs to be freed from this relationship, the servant needs to be freed from this relationship. And Paulo Freire, who is a Brazilian educational philosopher, said it's going to take action, but on the other side of the coin, it's going to take awareness. And he did this himself by teaching illiterate farmers in Brazil how to read. Once they learned how to read, they got that awareness. Then they went into action. They went and voted, and they were able to change the power structure of the colonies who took away their rights. So Paulo Freire is one of my heroes. He lived this theory. It's not only a theory, it's not only a philosophy, but he lived it, he taught it. So with power comes this awareness. And with the awareness, now we're able to think about purposeful action. What is it I can do to be part of the solution instead of mindlessly being part of the problem? Let's keep going. Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. So now that you're aware, now that I've given you that half of the pie graph, I've given you this awareness. You can't act in ignorance anymore. Your action is to be... your action is a choice, rather. You can be part of the problem between powerful and powerless. You can be part of a solution. And I'd love to share with you some solutions after analyzing the next chapter. Of chapter 12, Tracing the Trajectories of Conquest. The big concept here is that history helps explain why Latino political power always seems less significant than the population numbers. And remember from the previous module, as the American identity evolves, the decreasing white majority must find new ways to evolve, to preserve the white national identity. So we previously have looked at ways that white identity might evolve to preserve exclusion and race-based privilege. As we look forward, let's also trace how we got here. Tracing the trajectories of preserving white national identity, tracing the trajectories of how white national identity has colonized, specifically the Southwest. And the first thing we need to distinguish is between colonization and conquest. And it's really a matter of time. This author says on page 71 that colonization refers to temporary seizures of land and displacement of people, whereas conquest is the permanent seizure of land, the permanent usurpation of culture, as in the U.S. conquest of Indians and Mexico. So we're looking at permanent power changes rather than temporary colonial power changes. And I'd like to tie these two readings together by finding some evidence and instances of colonization, of conquest, by using the definitions of colonization from the previous chapter, chapter 10. So on chapter 10, on page 61, my highlighted color-coded notes, the first definition of colonization is this condition: the land of one people is invaded by people from another country who later use military force to gain and maintain control. Chapter 12, we trace the trajectories of conquest, and we see on page 72, last paragraph, what could not be had by purchase was taken by force. Most contemporary historians agree that President Polk provoked the United States' war against Mexico as a pretext for accomplishing his expansionist purposes. So using military force to gain territory. We have evidence of that in American history. What else do we have evidence of? The second definition of colonization is that, and we know that the author of chapter 10 says colonization. The author of chapter 12 says, let's move past that and say conquest because it's still happening. So the definition of conquest, number 2, is that the original inhabitants become subjects of the conquerors involuntarily. Well, slavery is an example of becoming subjects of conquest or conquerors involuntarily, and we find instance of that on page 73. Slavery, first sentence, and the Southern wish for expansion of the number of slave states played a prominent role in the annexation of Texas, the first seizure of Mexican territory by the United States government. And the third paragraph down, I found this really interesting. Slave owners attempted to circumvent the law by freeing their slaves while simultaneously forcing them to become indentured servants for life. That is definitely a creative loophole to keep a group of people subjected involuntarily, keeping them involuntary slaves. In a master-slave relationship, the slaves are not willingly slaves. That's an involuntary action. And we see that that happened in the United States in the early 1820s. So it's not like this faraway thing that happened in a different continent. This is local. This is home. Third definition of conquest: the conquered have an alien culture and government imposed upon them. We see that on page 76 with the New Mexico Enabling Act of 1910, where this act required that public education shall always be conducted in English, and so that it would be alien language, the language of an alien culture, and that the ability to read, write, speak, and understand the English language without an interpreter shall be a necessary qualification for all state officers and members of the state legislature. So now it's an alien government saying if you don't speak the language of our government, then you certainly can't serve in our government and represent the interest of your people, the interest of the people that you serve on this land that we took over. The fourth definition of conquest: the conquered become the victims of racism and cultural genocide. That's a typo. And victims of racism and cultural genocide, and are relegated to a submerged status. We see evidence of that on page 71, second paragraph down. Racism played an important role in purporting to justify the war of conquest against Mexico and in limiting the political power of Mexicans within the United States. And then the author gives some examples of the mixed races of Mexicans posed an affront to Anglo ideals of racial purity. So you have a group of people who have ideals of racial purity, entering, colonizing, and displacing a group by making them victims of racism and race-based privilege, relegating them to a submerged status. Fifth ingredient in the recipe for colonization is that the conquered are rendered politically and economically powerless. Does America have a history of this? And by history, I mean, how about currently? I'm going to read you something that I did not know about until I read this chapter. Page 77. To this day, so we're not in the 1800s anymore. To this day, Puerto Ricans remain essentially powerless in U.S. politics. Wow. Because Puerto Rico is not a state, it has no voting representation in Congress. So that is definitely an example of rendering people politically and economically powerless. And finally, the conquerors feel they have a mission in occupying the area in question and believe that they have undeniable privileges by virtue of their conquest. Staying at the top of page 77, we see that the assumption being that democracy was only for white people raised in cold Nordic climates. So if you are not in that group, you are excluded from having privileges. And again, on page 75, we see John Calhoun, a prominent Southern Democrat. He wrote about the racial implications of why we need to draw a border around Mexico and the territories we took by force from Mexico. And his reasoning, his belief of having an undeniable privilege and a mission is that we have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. Listen to the stories that we tell ourselves, we as humans, we as imperfect humans. So in this one person's eyes, and he shared this belief with many other people, that the only race that gets to be free is the white Caucasian race. So that is the history of how we got to this colonial status and this awareness without, of course, what the previous author writes, without rekindling hatred, without adding extra layers of condemnation and guilt. What can we do? And is there anything to be done? So you say, but Dr. Griffin, now that I have this knowledge, what am I supposed to do? I don't work in Congress. I don't make the law. I'm not an agent of change. I would say, and so would Paulo Freire, you've come to the right place. You've come to the place where we combine awareness with action. This chapter, these last two chapters, are all about tracing the trajectories of conquest, describing moments in time, looking for patterns, making observations, and what we're really here for is to look for cycle breakers. How do we disrupt this colonial mindset, this internal colonization? I don't want to be a part of that anymore. I want to be part of the solution. I want to break cycles. So we know that awareness got us here. This awareness that you've now reached in this current module. Reflection got us here. Action will get us out. So what actions will you take now that you have knowledge, now that you have awareness? And this awareness is power. Awareness of the geopolitics of race, how cultures have evolved depending on where geographical boundaries have been drawn around political gain. The U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, that's a geographical map that got drawn, yet political power got taken away. And then we also want to look at our awareness of, now that I've read this chapter and chapter 2 of Culture and Psychology, the loss, how does a culture, if it accumulates, how does it get lost? It can get lost through colonization, as we've learned, through subjugation, as we've learned with instances of slavery, and through policies that limit the transmission of cultural values, that limit rituals and languages. We saw that with English only being taught in the schools. How do we reckon this awareness of how we got to where we are today? What am I supposed to do? Well, I'll give you a few actions and what to think about next. How do I practice the action part of praxis? Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to practice being more mindful and purposeful with the language I use, especially the way that I use my language to label people. I'm going to ask them how they identify before I use my language to label them. In my limited knowledge, I don't know where people are from by looking at them. What do I know? Another way of being an agent of change, I'm going to look at the way that I exclude people. With my actions, turning my back towards people, not talking to both people in the room, there are some subtle actions that I can start to observe and notice. Am I positioning my body with my actions to exclude this person? Am I inviting all my coworkers except for the ethnic coworker out to drinks after work? How do I practice excluding people? And can I be more aware of not doing that? And then finally, one way I can be an agent of change is to change the way that I listen. Sometimes I could just shut up, and that's a huge action. The act of shutting up allows me to give space for other voices to be heard, other voices that aren't my voice. So this is how I'm going to practice the action of praxis now that I've given you some good stuff to reflect on and given you some of the awareness part of praxis. Up next, we have methods for studying culture and psychology. Take care.